They said, "You're too old to travel with us, Grandpa. Just watch the house." That was the moment everything changed. After a lifetime of sacrifice, after giving up my dreams and my future to raise them, my own grandchildren looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't good enough to be part of their lives. The next morning, I made a decision they never saw coming. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. For a decade, I was the man who held their world together after tragedy tore their parents away. I poured my savings, my strength, and my heart into making sure they never felt abandoned. I sold my most precious possessions, worked double shifts with aching hands, and gave up the retirement my wife and I had dreamed of, all so they could have a future. And yet, when the time came, they dismissed me like I was nothing. It all began 10 years ago when tragedy struck on Highway 95 and my daughter and son-in-law were taken from us in a terrible accident. Their children, Sarah, Michael, and Jessica, were just teenagers then, broken and lost. I was 62, ready to retire after decades as a master mechanic at Johnson's Auto Shop, ready to travel the world with my beloved wife, Martha. We had plans to see Ireland, where her grandmother was born, and the Northern Lights in Alaska. But life had other plans. 6 months later, Martha was gone too, her heart giving out from the grief. I was left with 3 teenagers who had lost everything, and I knew I had no choice but to fight for them. I sold Martha's engagement ring, the one I'd saved months of paychecks to buy 40 years earlier. I sold my restored 1967 Mustang, the car I had planned to pass down to my grandson. I cashed out my retirement, every penny I had saved across 30 years. I crawled under cars with arthritic hands, lifted engines when my body screamed to stop, and worked 16-hour shifts because they needed me. Slowly, I watched them heal. Sarah made it to nursing school. Michael excelled in business. Jessica found her gift in marketing. I sat in every audience, at every graduation, my eyes full of tears, knowing their parents would have been proud. I never missed a birthday, a school play, or a sports game. When they needed money for college, I borrowed against the house. When they needed cars, I bought them with my own hands and kept them running. 3 months ago, everything started to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. The kids, now successful adults with good jobs and bright futures, began talking about a vacation they were planning together. It started innocently enough, casual conversations over Sunday dinner about wanting to take a trip to celebrate their achievements. Sarah had just gotten promoted to head nurse at Metropolitan Hospital, Michael had landed a management position at a Fortune 500 company, and Jessica had started her own marketing consultancy. They deserved to celebrate, I thought. As the weeks went by, their vacation plans became more elaborate and exciting. They talked about visiting multiple countries in Europe, staying in 5-star hotels, dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, shopping in the fashion capitals of the world. They showed me pictures on their phones of the luxury accommodations they were booking, the expensive tours they were planning, the designer stores they wanted to visit in Paris and Milan. My heart swelled with pride hearing them talk so enthusiastically about their dreams coming true. At the same time, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered questions I tried to ignore. How could they afford such an extravagant trip? Even with their good jobs, a month-long luxury European vacation for 3 people would cost a fortune. During one particularly animated conversation about their itinerary, Sarah pulled out her laptop and showed me the hotels they had booked. The presidential suite at the Grand Hotel in Rome, a penthouse overlooking the Eiffel Tower in Paris, a luxury villa in the hills of Tuscany. Each night's accommodation cost more than I had spent on food in a month. Michael excitedly described the private tours they had arranged, the exclusive restaurants where they had made reservations, the first-class flights that would take them from city to city in comfort and style. Jessica showed me the shopping lists she had created, filled with designer handbags, Italian leather shoes, and Swiss watches that cost thousands of dollars each. As they talked, their faces glowing with excitement and anticipation, I found myself caught between genuine happiness for their success and a growing unease about the scale of their spending. The truth about their vacation funding hit me like a sledgehammer when I overheard Jessica discussing a large withdrawal with her bank. $30,000. The number echoed in my head as I stood frozen in the hallway. That amount represented more than I had spent on myself in the past 5 years combined. What really made my heart sink was the realization of where that money had come from. Over the past 10 years, I had given each of them exactly $10,000 from Martha's life insurance policy, money that was supposed to be my safety net for old age. I had told them it was an early inheritance, something to help them get established in their adult lives. I had been so careful to make it equal, so none of them would feel I had played favorites. But apparently, instead of using it responsibly as I had intended, they had saved it all for this extravagant vacation. The money I had sacrificed for, working until my body ached and my hands could barely grip a wrench, was being spent on luxury hotel rooms and designer handbags. The inheritance from Martha was funding champagne dinners and shopping sprees in European capitals. I thought about Martha's simple gold wedding band that I had sold to help pay for Michael's college textbooks, about her grandmother's pearl necklace that I had pawned to cover Jessica's study abroad expenses, about her hope chest full of handmade quilts that I had sold to help Sarah through nursing school. All of those precious memories, those tangible connections to the love of my life, had been sacrificed so these children could have opportunities and security. And now they were using that gift to fund a lifestyle that would have been unimaginable to Martha and me, even in our wildest dreams. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me that they were spending in 1 month what Martha and I had planned to live on for an entire year of retirement travel, the dreams we had never been able to fulfill because life, responsibility, and love had demanded different priorities. As I stood there in the hallway, listening to Jessica casually discuss spending $30,000 on vacation, I began to understand that my sacrifices hadn't created grateful, responsible adults. They had created entitled individuals who saw my love and generosity as their due rather than as extraordinary gifts that had come at tremendous personal cost. The vacation that was supposed to celebrate their success was actually a celebration of my failure to teach them the value of money, sacrifice, and gratitude. It was a month-long party funded by the dreams Martha and I had given up, the security we had sacrificed, and the future we had abandoned to give them every opportunity in the world. The moment that shattered my world forever came on a warm Tuesday evening in April, during what I thought would be a pleasant family dinner. I had prepared Martha's famous pot roast, the recipe she had perfected during our early years of marriage. I had set the dining room table with the good china, the set Martha and I had received as a wedding gift but rarely used because we were always saving it for special occasions. As they described their detailed itinerary over dinner, their faces animated with anticipation, I found myself caught up in their enthusiasm. I began to imagine what it would be like to see those places myself, to walk through the ancient streets of Rome, to stand before the masterpieces in the Louvre, to breathe the mountain air in the Swiss Alps. Before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out of my mouth with the innocent excitement of a child. I told them how wonderful their trip sounded, how proud I was of them for working so hard. And then, with a hopeful smile that I can still feel on my face when I remember that moment, I asked if there might be room for one more on their adventure, if their old grandpa could tag along and finally see some of the world. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched across the dining room table like a chasm, swallowing the warmth and joy that had filled the room just moments before. Sarah, Michael, and Jessica exchanged glances, the kind of meaningful looks that pass between people who have already had a conversation you weren't part of. Michael cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jessica suddenly became very interested in cutting her pot roast into precise, tiny pieces. Sarah, always the designated spokesperson for the group, took a deep breath and delivered the words that would replay in my mind every night for months to come. She told me, with what I suppose she thought was gentle kindness, that I was too old to travel with them, that I wouldn't enjoy the fast pace they had planned, that I would be more comfortable staying home in familiar surroundings. Michael nodded in agreement, adding that someone needed to watch the house while they were gone, to make sure everything was safe and secure. Jessica chimed in that they would bring me back souvenirs, as if a postcard or a keychain could somehow compensate for being excluded from what was essentially a family celebration funded by my own sacrifices. The casual cruelty of their dismissal, the complete lack of consideration for my feelings, and the assumption that I would simply accept being treated like an elderly burden who needed to be managed rather than included, hit me with such force that I actually felt physical pain in my chest. After that dinner, I retreated to my bedroom like a wounded animal seeking shelter. I sat on the edge of the bed Martha and I had shared for 43 years, staring at the faded wallpaper she had picked out when we first bought this house. The silence in the house felt different now, not peaceful, but hollow, like the echo in an empty church. My hands were shaking as the full weight of what had just happened began to settle on my shoulders. They thought I was too old to travel, too old to enjoy new experiences, too old to be part of their lives in any meaningful way. At 72, I had apparently crossed some invisible line from being a beloved grandfather to being a burden, an inconvenience, someone to be managed rather than included. The memories began flooding back with painful clarity, each one a reminder of what I had given up and what I had sacrificed for the three people who now saw me as nothing more than an elderly house-sitter. I remembered working Christmas Eve at the auto shop because the holiday overtime pay meant I could afford to buy Sarah the art supplies she wanted, Michael the baseball glove he had been eyeing, and Jessica the dress she needed for her school formal. I remembered the night I spent in the emergency room with Martha, holding her hand as her heart struggled to keep beating, knowing I should be focused entirely on her, but unable to stop worrying about how I would pay for the medical bills and still have enough money to send the kids to college. I remembered selling my father's watch, the only thing I had left of him, to pay for Michael's semester abroad program, watching him light up with excitement while my heart broke a little more. I remembered Martha's jewelry box, filled with modest but meaningful pieces that had marked the milestones of our marriage, each one sold one by one to fund their dreams, while our own remained locked away in the realm of someday and when we can afford it. I remembered the vacation brochures Martha used to collect, pictures of Ireland's green hills and cozy bed and breakfasts, Alaska's northern lights dancing across the sky, Route 66 stretching endlessly toward adventure and freedom. We had planned to see the world together when we retired, to finally put ourselves first after decades of putting everyone else's needs before our own. But those dreams had died with Martha, buried under the weight of responsibility and the assumption that my role in life was to give everything I had to ensure that others could live their dreams. That night, unable to sleep and feeling like a stranger in my own home, I wandered through the house that held 40 years of memories. As I passed Jessica's old bedroom, now converted into her home office, I heard the unmistakable sound of her voice, bright and animated in the way that meant she was talking to friends rather than family. I paused outside her door, not intending to eavesdrop, but unable to keep moving when I heard my own name mentioned. What I heard next felt like a physical blow to my chest, each word hitting me with the force of a hammer against my ribs. Jessica was talking to someone on the phone, probably her college roommate, and she was laughing, actually laughing, as she described the dinner conversation and my pathetic attempt to invite myself on their vacation. She called me the old man and joked about how awkward it had been when I suggested coming along. She said, and I will never forget these exact words, "Can you imagine dragging Grandpa around Europe? He'd just slow us down and complain about everything. We'd spend the whole trip looking for bathrooms and places for him to sit down. Thank God we talked him out of it." The person on the other end must have said something funny, because Jessica burst into laughter again before continuing. "I mean, we love him and everything, but he's just so old now. He gets tired walking to the mailbox. Can you picture him trying to keep up with us in Paris? We'd never get to see anything. Plus, he'd probably want to eat at McDonald's every night instead of trying real French cuisine. You know how old people are with food? I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand gripping the wall for support as her words cut through me like broken glass. This was how they saw me. Not as the man who had raised them, sacrificed for them, loved them unconditionally through their darkest hours. Not as someone with wisdom and experience who might actually enhance their travel experience. I was just the old man, an inconvenience to be managed, a burden to be avoided, someone whose presence would somehow diminish their joy and freedom. The casual cruelty in her voice, the complete lack of empathy or gratitude, the way she reduced me to nothing more than a stereotype of elderly incompetence, shattered something inside me that I don't think ever truly healed. As I listened to her continue the conversation, describing how they had planned this trip specifically to get away from family obligations, I realized that I had become exactly what I had always feared, a lonely old man whose family saw him as nothing more than an obligation. The next morning brought a shock that I should have seen coming, but somehow never imagined they would actually implement. I woke up early as I always did, my body trained by decades of getting up before dawn to start work at the auto shop. I was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the morning paper and enjoying the quiet moments before the day began, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock that no longer recognized it. Michael was standing at the front door, looking frustrated and confused as he jiggled his key in the lock. Behind him, I could see a locksmith's van parked in the driveway. My stomach dropped as the reality of the situation became clear. They had changed the locks on the house without telling me. The house where I had lived for over 40 years, the house where I had raised them, the house that was still legally in my name, had been made inaccessible to me by my own grandchildren. When Michael finally came around to the kitchen door and let himself in, looking embarrassed but trying to act casual, he delivered the news with the kind of forced cheerfulness people use when they're trying to make something terrible sound reasonable. He told me that they had decided to change all the locks for security purposes while they were away on vacation. They were concerned about break-ins in the neighborhood, he said, though we had never had any security problems in all the years we had lived here. But then came the part that really twisted the knife. Michael handed me a new key, but it wasn't for the main house. It was for the converted garage apartment, the small space over the detached garage that we had fixed up years ago as a guest room. He told me, with what I suppose he thought was generous consideration, that I could stay in the garage apartment while they were away. It would be more convenient, he said, because I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining the big house all by myself. It would be cozier, he claimed, more suitable for just one person. The implication was clear. I was being moved out of the main house, the house I had bought and paid for, the house where I had raised them and created a loving home for our family. I was being relegated to the garage apartment like a tenant, like hired help, like someone whose presence in the main house was no longer welcome or appropriate. The transformation from beloved grandfather to inconvenient burden was now complete, and they had made it official by physically relocating me to a space that reflected my new status in their lives. Moving my belongings from the main house to the garage apartment felt like organizing my own funeral. Box by box, I carried 40 years of memories across the backyard, each trip a reminder of how thoroughly my life had been reorganized without my consent. The garage apartment was clean and functional, but it felt like a dollhouse compared to the real home I was being forced to abandon. As I unpacked my clothes into the small dresser, I found myself surrounded by the evidence of how little space my life now occupied in theirs. But it was what I found that evening that truly opened my eyes to how my grandchildren really saw me. While cleaning up and making sure everything was organized for my exile, I discovered Jessica's old tablet wedged between the couch cushions. The screen was cracked but still functional, and when I picked it up to set it aside, it automatically opened to her family group chat. What I saw there made my previous discovery of Jessica's phone conversation seem mild by comparison. Months of messages scrolled past my eyes, a detailed record of how they really felt about me and the burden I represented in their lives. They had been planning this European vacation for over 6 months, and throughout that entire time, they had been discussing how to handle the grandpa problem. That's what they called me in their messages, the grandpa problem. They joked about my stories being boring and repetitive, about how I asked too many questions about their personal lives, about how I still treated them like children instead of recognizing they were successful adults. They complained about Sunday dinners, calling them mandatory family time that cut into their social lives and career networking opportunities. They mocked my cooking, saying Martha's recipes were outdated and bland compared to the sophisticated cuisine they enjoyed at trendy restaurants. They made fun of my clothes, my habits, my concerns about their spending and lifestyle choices. But what hurt the most were the messages about their financial plans. They had calculated exactly how much money I had given them over the years, not with gratitude, but with a sense of entitlement, as if those sacrifices were their due rather than gifts of love. They discussed the house as if it already belonged to them, making plans for renovations and changes they wanted to make once I was no longer in the way. Reading those messages was like discovering that the people I loved most in the world had been living double lives, presenting one face to me while revealing their true feelings to each other in private conversations filled with contempt and mockery. Sitting alone in that garage apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been deemed inconvenient, I found myself drowning in memories that now felt like evidence in a trial where I was both the plaintiff and the defendant. Every sacrifice I had made, every dream I had deferred, every moment of pride and joy I had experienced in raising these 3 children played through my mind like a movie reel of my own foolishness. I remembered the day I brought them home from the hospital after their parents' funeral, 3 broken souls clinging to each other in the back seat of my old pickup truck. Sarah had been catatonic with grief, unable to speak or eat for days. Michael had alternated between violent anger and desperate sobbing. Jessica had wanted to drop out of college and get a job to help support her younger siblings. I had held them together through sheer will and unconditional love, becoming father, mother, counselor, and cheerleader all at once. I remembered the sleepless nights when nightmares would wake them, and how I would sit on the edge of their beds, telling them stories about their parents, about how love never truly dies, but lives on in the hearts of those who remember. I remembered learning to braid Sarah's hair for school dances, watching YouTube videos at 62 years old to master French braids and ponytails because Martha had always handled those feminine mysteries. I remembered teaching Michael to drive, patiently explaining the mechanics of the clutch and the careful balance needed for smooth shifting. I remembered helping Jessica with her college applications, staying up late to proofread her essays and research scholarship opportunities, using my limited computer skills to navigate financial aid websites that seemed designed to confuse old men like me. I remembered the pride that swelled in my chest at every graduation, every achievement, every moment when I could see their parents' best qualities shining through their personalities. I remembered working overtime shifts until my arthritis made it almost impossible to grip a wrench, pushing through the pain because Christmas was coming and I wanted to make sure they had everything they needed to feel loved and secure. I remembered selling Martha's engagement ring to pay for Sarah's nursing school textbooks, standing in the pawn shop with tears in my eyes as I handed over the symbol of the greatest love story of my life. But now, sitting in exile in my own backyard, I began to see those memories differently. My unconditional love and endless sacrifice had not created grateful, compassionate adults. Instead, it had created entitled, selfish individuals who saw kindness as weakness and generosity as their due. That night in the garage apartment, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the house where I no longer belonged, something fundamental shifted inside me. The grief and hurt and betrayal that had consumed me for days began to crystallize into something harder, clearer, more purposeful. I realized that my unconditional love and endless sacrifice had actually prevented them from developing into truly independent, grateful adults. They had never learned to appreciate what they had because they had never experienced wanting. They had never developed empathy because they had never faced real consequences for their callousness. They had never grown into truly responsible adults because I had always been there to catch them when they fell, to solve their problems, to smooth their path through life. For the first time in 10 years, I began to think not as a grandfather whose identity was defined by giving and sacrificing, but as a man who had been taken advantage of, manipulated, and discarded when he was no longer useful. The transformation was gradual but unstoppable, like ice slowly forming on a pond until the surface becomes solid enough to walk on. My hurt began to freeze into resolve. My disappointment began to harden into determination. My love, which had been unconditional for so long, began to develop conditions that had never existed before. I found myself thinking not about what I could do for them, but about what they had done to me. Not about how to make them happy, but about how to make them understand the consequences of their choices. Not about how to continue sacrificing for their benefit, but about how to reclaim my own dignity and self-respect. I realized that in trying to be everything to them, I had allowed myself to become nothing. In giving them everything they wanted, I had taught them that they deserved everything without earning it. In protecting them from every hardship, I had prevented them from developing the strength and character that come from overcoming challenges. As the night wore on and dawn approached, I made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. I decided that it was time for my grandchildren to learn what it meant to stand on their own, to face the world without a safety net, to understand the value of the gifts they had been given by experiencing life without them. I decided that it was time for them to discover what independence really meant and what it cost to treat family as expendable conveniences rather than precious relationships deserving of respect and gratitude. The next morning, I began what I now think of as my investigation phase, approaching the task with the same methodical precision I had once applied to diagnosing complex engine problems. My first stop was the county courthouse, where I requested copies of all the property records for our family home. What I discovered there was simultaneously shocking and completely predictable, given what I now understood about my grandchildren's character. The house at 42 Maple Street was still legally and completely in my name. Despite months of promises to handle the paperwork, despite numerous conversations about transferring ownership to reflect our family arrangement, they had never actually completed the legal process of property transfer. When I asked the clerk about the requirements for such a transfer, she explained that it would have required several $1,000s for fees, taxes, and legal documentation. The cost would have been money that my grandchildren had apparently preferred to save for their European vacation rather than invest in securing their housing situation. The irony was not lost on me that they were willing to spend $30,000 on 1 month of luxury travel, but unwilling to spend $3,000 to actually own the home they had been treating as their personal property. Armed with this knowledge, I made my next stop at the office of Robert Martinez, a longtime friend who had recently retired from his law practice but still maintained his license for special cases and personal favors. Robert and I had known each other for over 20 years, ever since I had repaired his vintage Corvette and refused to charge him full price because I knew he was struggling to build his practice. When I explained the situation to Robert, his expression grew more serious with each detail I shared. As a family law attorney, he had seen plenty of cases involving ungrateful relatives and financial exploitation of elderly family members, but he seemed genuinely shocked by the level of callousness my grandchildren had displayed. After reviewing the property documents I had brought, Robert confirmed what I had suspected. As the sole legal owner of the house, I had every right to determine who lived there and under what circumstances. The fact that my grandchildren were adults with no legal claim to the property meant that I could require them to leave with appropriate notice, regardless of how long they had been living there or what contributions they might claim to have made to the household. Robert's investigation into my grandchildren's financial situation revealed layers of irresponsibility that left me both angry and sadly unsurprised. Using his professional resources, he was able to pull credit reports that painted a disturbing picture of how they had been managing the opportunities I had provided them. Despite their good jobs and the substantial financial gifts I had given them over the years, all three of them were carrying massive amounts of credit card debt. Sarah owed over $15,000 spread across 6 different cards, much of it accumulated through online shopping and expensive restaurants. Michael had nearly $20,000 in credit card debt, plus a car loan for a luxury vehicle that cost more than I had earned in my best year as a mechanic. Jessica owed $18,000 on credit cards and had taken out a business loan that she was already behind on payments for. But the real revelation came when Robert discovered how they had been using my name and credit history. Over the past 3 years, they had listed me as a reference on numerous financial applications, using my excellent credit score to secure better terms on loans and credit cards. They had done this without my knowledge or permission, essentially trading on my reputation and financial responsibility to fund their irresponsible spending habits. The pattern was clear. They had been living far beyond their actual means, using credit to maintain a lifestyle that their salaries couldn't support, all while treating me as their financial safety net and backup plan. Robert explained that their vacation was actually being funded by a combination of the money I had given them and additional credit card debt they were taking on. They weren't financially successful adults celebrating their achievements. They were financially irresponsible young people living on borrowed money and borrowed time, using my sacrifices and my credit worthiness to maintain the illusion of prosperity. When Robert asked me what I wanted to do with this information, I felt a clarity of purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. These 3 people had not only taken advantage of my love and generosity, they had actually put my financial security at risk by using my name and credit without permission. They had treated me as both a source of funds and a financial guarantor, while simultaneously deciding that I was too old and inconvenient to be part of their lives. The hypocrisy was staggering. I was good enough to provide them with money, housing, and financial backing, but not good enough to travel with them or be treated with basic respect and consideration. Working with Robert over the following weeks felt like planning the most important repair job of my life. Except instead of fixing an engine, I was fixing a family dynamic that had become dangerously unbalanced. Robert approached the situation with the thoroughness of a good attorney, but also with the understanding of a friend who could see how much pain I was carrying. He explained my options clearly and completely, never pushing me toward any particular course of action, but making sure I understood the full scope of what was legally possible. The first option was eviction. As the sole owner of the property, I had the legal right to require anyone living in the house to leave with appropriate notice. In our state, that meant 30 days written notice, after which I could pursue legal action if they refused to vacate. The second option was to sell the house. Since it was entirely in my name and they had no legal claim to it, I could put it on the market immediately. The third option was to remove them from any financial accounts where I had added them as authorized users or beneficiaries, and to formally revoke any permissions they had been using to apply for credit in my name. As we discussed these options, Robert asked me a question that cut to the heart of the matter. What did I actually want to achieve? Did I want revenge for the hurt they had caused me? Did I want to teach them a lesson about consequences and responsibility? Did I want to protect myself from further financial exploitation? The answer wasn't immediately clear to me. But as I thought about it over several days, I realized that what I wanted most was for them to understand the reality of their situation and the consequences of their choices. I wanted them to experience what it meant to be truly independent without my financial support and safety net. I wanted them to learn what it cost to maintain the lifestyle they had been taking for granted. Most importantly, I wanted them to understand that love and respect are not one-way streets, that family relationships require mutual consideration and gratitude, not just endless taking from one member while treating that person as an inconvenient burden. If they were going to treat me as too old and irrelevant to be part of their lives, then they needed to learn what life looked like without the benefits of my presence, my support, and my unconditional love. The preparation phase required careful planning and precise timing. Robert helped me prepare all the necessary legal documents, but we agreed that the timing of their delivery would be crucial to achieving maximum impact. First, we prepared formal eviction notices for all 3 grandchildren, clearly stating that they had 30 days from the date of service to vacate the premises. The notices included specific legal language about their lack of ownership rights and my authority as the sole property owner to determine occupancy. Second, we prepared documentation to remove them from all accounts where they had been listed as authorized users or beneficiaries. This included my bank accounts, credit cards, insurance policies, and retirement accounts. Third, we prepared a comprehensive letter explaining my actions and the reasons behind them. This wasn't a legal document, but rather a personal communication that would help them understand that their behavior had consequences. The letter detailed specific examples of their ungrateful behavior, their financial misconduct, and their treatment of me as an inconvenient burden rather than a beloved family member who had sacrificed everything for their benefit. Robert also helped me make practical arrangements for the transition period. We contacted a storage facility and arranged for a unit large enough to hold their belongings. I would pay for the first month's rent as a final gift, but after that, they would be responsible for the cost or risk losing their possessions. We researched local apartment complexes and housing options in their price range, so I could provide them with realistic information about what they could afford on their actual salaries without my financial support. The goal wasn't to leave them homeless or destitute, but to force them to confront the reality of their financial situation and take responsibility for their own lives and choices. Throughout this preparation phase, I found myself oscillating between determination and doubt. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, if there might be some other way to address the situation. But then I would remember Jessica's laughter as she mocked me to her friends, or Michael's casual dismissal of my desire to be included in their lives, or Sarah's assumption that I would simply accept being relegated to the garage apartment, and my resolve would strengthen again. They had made their choice about my value in their lives. Now it was time for them to experience the consequences of that choice. The timing of my plan was crucial, and I spent considerable thought determining the perfect moment to execute what Robert had started calling Operation Independence. My grandchildren were scheduled to leave for Europe on a Tuesday morning in early June, with their flight departing at 7 in the morning. They had been counting down the days with increasing excitement, their conversations dominated by last-minute packing decisions and debates about which designer stores to visit first in Paris. I decided to give them exactly 24 hours to settle into their vacation mindset, to post their first social media photos from first-class airline lounges, to begin spending money they thought they had unlimited access to through my continued financial support. On Wednesday morning, while they were probably having their first expensive breakfast in a Parisian cafe, I began implementing the plan that would fundamentally change all of our lives. My first action was to visit every bank and financial institution where I had accounts that included them as authorized users or beneficiaries. At each location, I formally removed their names from all accounts, canceled their credit cards that were linked to my accounts, and revised all beneficiary information to exclude them entirely. The bank managers were professional and efficient, though I could see the curiosity in their eyes about why an elderly man was suddenly cutting off 3 younger family members from significant financial resources. My second action was to contact the storage facility and arrange for the removal of all their belongings from the main house. I had hired a team of professional movers because I wanted everything done quickly and efficiently. Watching strangers carry out furniture, clothes, electronics, and personal items that represented 10 years of shared family life was more emotionally difficult than I had expected. Each box that disappeared from the house took with it memories of birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, and quiet Sunday mornings. But I reminded myself that these same belongings represented the lives of 3 people who had decided I was too old and inconvenient to be part of their future plans. My third action was to change all the locks on the house, ensuring that I would never again be surprised by people who treated my home as their personal property while treating me as an unwelcome guest. The locksmith was the same one they had used, and he remembered the previous job with some confusion about why the same house needed new locks again so soon. Thursday morning in Europe would have been Wednesday evening for me, and I spent those evening hours implementing the final phase of my plan while my grandchildren were probably enjoying an expensive dinner at some trendy restaurant, completely unaware that their entire life structure was being systematically dismantled 7,000 miles away. I sent detailed emails to each of them individually, explaining the changes I had made and the reasons behind my decisions. I didn't want them to discover their new reality through bounced credit card transactions or frantic phone calls to bank customer service representatives. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't some impulsive emotional reaction, but a carefully considered response to their behavior and choices. In Sarah's email, I specifically addressed her role as the oldest and the unofficial spokesperson for the group, reminding her of the numerous conversations we had about family loyalty and responsibility. I detailed the financial contributions I had made to her nursing education and contrasted those sacrifices with her casual dismissal of me as too old to be part of the family's celebration. In Michael's email, I focused on the business and financial aspects, knowing that he prided himself on his MBA education and corporate success. I provided a detailed accounting of every dollar I had invested in his education, his car, his living expenses, and his various needs over the past 10 years. I calculated the total at over $150,000, money that had come directly from my retirement savings, Martha's life insurance, and the sale of personal belongings that had represented decades of our marriage. I explained that in the business world he claimed to understand so well, such an investment would typically come with expectations of returns, respect, and ongoing relationship management. I pointed out that treating your primary investor as an inconvenient burden was not typically considered sound business practice. In Jessica's email, I addressed her marketing expertise and her apparent skill at managing communications, except when it came to her own family relationships. I reminded her that I had overheard her phone conversation mocking me to her friends, and I asked her to consider what kind of message that sent about her character and values. Each email concluded with the same essential message. They had 30 days from the date they returned from vacation to find alternative housing arrangements, and they would need to do so without access to my financial resources, credit history, or property. I also included the address of the storage facility where their belongings were being held and the contact information for several apartment complexes that offered housing in their actual price range. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't about punishment or revenge, but about natural consequences and the reality of independent adult life. They had declared me too old and irrelevant to be part of their celebration of success. Now they would have the opportunity to experience that success without the safety net and support system that had made it possible in the first place. The day of their return was a Saturday in early July, and I spent the morning sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the clock with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Their flight was scheduled to arrive at 2 in the afternoon, and I estimated they would be home by 4 o'clock, probably exhausted from the long international flight and eager to rest in familiar surroundings. Instead, they would find themselves locked out of the house they had assumed was theirs, surrounded by luggage from a vacation that had probably maxed out their credit cards, facing a reality they had never been forced to confront before. At exactly 4:15, Michael's luxury car pulled into the driveway, followed by Sarah's sedan. I could see them through the window, moving slowly and tiredly as they began unloading multiple suitcases, shopping bags, and souvenir purchases from what had clearly been a month of extravagant spending. They looked tanned and relaxed, with the satisfied exhaustion of people who had experienced everything they had dreamed of experiencing. Jessica was laughing about something as she struggled with an obviously expensive leather suitcase, probably purchased during their shopping excursions in Milan or Paris. Then Michael approached the front door with his key, and everything changed. I watched him try the lock once, then twice, then look at his key with confusion before trying again. He called to his sisters, who approached with their own keys and their own confused expressions. For several minutes, all three of them stood on the front porch, trying different combinations of keys and discussing possible explanations for why none of their keys worked. I could see the moment when they began to understand that this wasn't some mistake or mechanical malfunction, but a deliberate action. Their body language shifted from confusion to concern to the beginnings of real alarm. Sarah pulled out her phone and tried calling me, and I let it ring through to voicemail. Michael walked around the house, checking all the windows and looking for any sign of forced entry or other explanation. Jessica sat down heavily on the front porch steps, still wearing her expensive European vacation clothes, surrounded by luggage that represented thousands of dollars of spending, looking for the first time like someone who didn't have unlimited access to resources and solutions. When I finally opened the front door and stepped onto the porch where my 3 grandchildren were sitting among their vacation luggage, looking confused and increasingly worried, the confrontation that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. For 10 years, every difficult conversation had been resolved with me backing down, compromising, or finding some way to accommodate their needs and preferences. But not today. Today, I stood on the front porch of the house I had owned for 40 years, looking at 3 adults who had spent a month living in luxury on money that represented my life's sacrifices, and I felt nothing but cold determination. Sarah, always the spokesperson, was the first to speak. She asked me what was happening, why their keys didn't work, whether there had been some kind of emergency while they were away. Her tone was still casual, still assuming that whatever inconvenience this represented, I would quickly fix it and restore their comfort and security. When I told them that I had changed the locks deliberately, that their belongings were in storage, and that they were no longer welcome to live in my house, the silence that followed was absolute. Michael was the first to recover from the shock, and his reaction was exactly what I had expected. Anger, indignation, a demand to know what I thought I was doing, what right I had to treat them this way, how I could be so ungrateful after everything they had done for me, everything they had done for me. The irony of that phrase, coming from someone who had just spent $30,000 on vacation while calling me too old to be included, was almost breathtaking in its complete reversal of reality. When I began to respond with specific examples of their behavior, Michael interrupted to tell me I was being unreasonable, that I was too emotional to think clearly, that maybe I needed to see a doctor. The condescension in his voice, the immediate assumption that my actions must be the result of mental incompetence rather than justified response to their behavior, actually strengthened my resolve rather than undermining it. Jessica tried a different approach, alternating between tears and appeals to family loyalty. She reminded me of their parents' death, of how we had all supported each other through that tragedy. She asked me how I could throw away 10 years of love and shared history over some misunderstanding about vacation plans. But when I explained that this wasn't about vacation plans, that this was about years of disrespect, financial exploitation, and their treatment of me as an inconvenient burden, her tears turned to accusations. She accused me of being manipulative, of using money and housing as weapons to control them. For over an hour, we stood on that porch, having the most honest conversation our family had ever had. I told them about overhearing Jessica's phone call mocking me. I told them about finding their group chat messages referring to me as the grandpa problem. I told them about discovering their unauthorized use of my name and credit on financial applications. But most importantly, I told them about the moment when they had looked me in the eye and told me I was too old to be part of their family celebration, too much of a burden to be included in the joy that my own sacrifices had made possible. The weeks that followed their return became a masterclass in the difference between genuine family loyalty and manipulative desperation. Once my grandchildren realized that I was serious about my decision and that no amount of arguing or pleading was going to change my mind, they began reaching out to other family members, trying to rally support for their position and pressure me into backing down. What they discovered, much to their shock and dismay, was that the rest of our extended family had been watching their behavior for years and had formed their own opinions about our relationship dynamics. My sister Helen was the first person Sarah called. Helen had visited us several times over the past decade and had witnessed firsthand how my grandchildren treated me. She had seen them interrupt me when I was speaking, dismiss my opinions as outdated, and treat my home as their personal property while treating me like an inconvenient tenant. When Sarah called her crying about how unreasonably I was behaving, Helen's response was swift and unsympathetic. She told Sarah that she had been waiting for years for me to stand up for myself, that their behavior toward me had been appalling, and that they were finally experiencing the consequences of treating family like servants. Martha's brother Jim had an even more direct response. When Michael called him hoping for support and possibly financial assistance, Jim told him that he had been disgusted by their treatment of me for years, that he had tried to talk to me about standing up for myself multiple times, and that he was proud of me for finally drawing boundaries and demanding basic respect. He refused to offer them any money or housing assistance, telling Michael that it was time for him to learn what it meant to be truly independent. Even their few remaining friends from high school and college began to distance themselves once they heard the full story. Most of their peers were struggling with student loans, entry-level salaries, and the normal challenges of building adult lives from scratch. The idea that 3 people in their 20s had been living rent-free in a beautiful house with full financial support from their grandfather while treating him with such disrespect and ingratitude was shocking to people who had been working multiple jobs just to pay for studio apartments. Within 2 weeks, it became clear that their attempts to portray me as an unreasonable, vindictive old man were backfiring spectacularly. Instead of generating sympathy and support, their calls for help were generating lectures about gratitude, responsibility, and respect for elders who had sacrificed everything for their benefit. The reality of their financial situation hit them with the force of a freight train once they were forced to confront it without my support. Sarah discovered that her credit card debt and expensive lifestyle had left her with virtually no savings for security deposits. Michael's luxury car payment, combined with his massive debt, meant that even his MBA salary wasn't enough to cover independent living in the style to which he had become accustomed. Jessica's marketing consultancy looked much less viable when she had to cover all of her own expenses without my financial backing. 6 months later, as I sit in the first-class cabin of an Aer Lingus flight bound for Dublin, Ireland, I can hardly believe the transformation that has taken place in all of our lives. The decision to sell the house had been difficult, but ultimately liberating, representing the final step in my journey from being someone defined by what I could give others to being someone who was free to pursue his own dreams and happiness. The sale price, combined with my retirement savings and Social Security, has given me a level of financial security I never thought possible, along with the freedom to finally live the life Martha and I had always dreamed of sharing. The retirement community where I now live is everything we had imagined when we talked about our golden years together. I have friends my own age who share my interests and experiences, activities that challenge and engage me, and a sense of independence and dignity that I had almost forgotten was possible. I no longer wake up each morning wondering what financial crisis I might need to solve or what disrespectful behavior I might need to tolerate in order to maintain family harmony. Instead, I wake up planning adventures, learning new skills, and enjoying the company of people who value my presence rather than merely tolerating it. My grandchildren, meanwhile, have experienced their own transformation, though theirs has been considerably more challenging. Sarah has moved into a modest apartment with 2 roommates, something she never imagined she would need to do at 28 years old. But the experience of living within her actual means has given her a deeper appreciation for financial security and a better understanding of the sacrifices that others make to achieve it. Michael had to sell his luxury car and move to a smaller apartment in a less trendy neighborhood, adjustments that initially felt like devastating setbacks, but have ultimately helped him focus on building real financial success rather than maintaining the appearance of prosperity. Jessica has had to completely restructure her business model, focusing on sustainable growth rather than expensive networking and superficial image management. But perhaps most importantly, all 3 of them have begun to understand the difference between entitlement and gratitude, between independence and exploitation, between family loyalty and family abuse. They have started reaching out to me, not with demands or expectations, but with genuine apologies and expressions of appreciation for everything I did for them over the years. The conversations are still awkward and tentative, but they represent the beginning of relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. As my plane begins its descent into Dublin, I pull out the small leather journal that contains Martha's notes and pictures from her research about her family's Irish heritage, the trip we had planned to take together but never had the chance to make. "I'm finally here, Martha," I whisper to the window, watching the green hills of Ireland come into view below. "I'm finally living the life we dreamed of, and I'm finally free to be the man you fell in love with rather than just the man everyone needed me to be. The adventure is just beginning, and for the first time in 10 years, I'm living it for myself." Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.